How could you?
We must stand our ground!
This is madness, utter madness.
The year is 1754, and the place is North America, more specifically, the northern and interior parts of what today we call the United States. But if you showed a typical person from that time and place a map of the United States, they would have a hard time recognizing it. Much of the land west of the Appalachian Mountains was completely unknown to Europeans. The established settlements were confined to the Atlantic coast, and the interior of the continent was a vast wilderness inhabited by many different native peoples. Despite it, East North America was far from the backwater. In fact, for much of the 18th century, it was one of the most contested regions on Earth. While no fighting was taking place at the moment, the entire continent was on edge. French, British, and native peoples all coexisted here. But none felt entirely comfortable with the presence of the others, and all of them knew that the uneasy peace could shatter at any moment. This quiet continent was sitting on a powder keg, just waiting for a spark to ignite it. In T-Series, we're going to find out how and why that happened. In this episode, let's get acquainted with our stage and its many inhabitants. Welcome to the first episode of Fire on the Horizon. Today, Western Pennsylvania is home to Pittsburgh, a city of nearly 300,000 people. In 1754, though, the area around present-day Pittsburgh was known as the Forks of the Ohio and was home to Fort Necessity. This fort was built by the British shortly before the start of the French and Indian War, part of the larger 7 Years' War, and it was an important symbol of British colonial authority in the region. Just downriver, however, across the Allegheny River and about 25 miles away, the French had established a fort of their own. They called it Fort Duquesne. As the crow flies, the two forts are only about 15 miles apart. Both were situated along the Ohio River, which had become an important thoroughfare for the fur trade, and both were attempting to exert colonial control over an area that had been contested for decades. In other words, the two forts were rivals, but they weren't the only ones. Further south along the Ohio River, the British had another fort at the confluence of the Monongahela and Ohio rivers. They called it Fort Prince George. And farther north, near present-day Cleveland, there was Fort LeBoeuf. Then even farther north were the British trading posts of Venango and Presqu'île, and that was just on the Ohio River. Farther west, near present-day Chicago, the French had Fort Detroit, while the British had Fort Niagara. Meanwhile, on the Great Lakes, the British also had forts at Michilimackinac, St. Joseph, and St. Ignace. These various trading posts and forts were typically staffed by European traders and soldiers, but they were surrounded by thousands of acres of wild lands. Since the earliest days of European contact, these lands had been used by dozens of Native American tribes for hunting, gathering, and trade, and they would continue to be used by Native Americans regardless of who controlled the forts. For example, during the French and Indian War, several of these tribes sided with the French, including the Hurons, the Ottawas, the Ojibways, and the Miamis. They fought alongside the French troops and provided them with supplies and intelligence. But some tribes, like the Iroquois, sided with the British, as did the Cherokee and the Choctaw farther south. That's right. Even though this war was fought primarily in North America, it wasn't just a battle between North American tribes. It was part of a larger conflict that involved European powers from around the world. It was, in fact, part of the 7 Years' War, which pitted the British and their allies against the French and their Native American allies in North America, Europe, and India. The name given to the North American portion of the war was the French and Indian War, because those were the two sides opposing each other. But the origins of the war can actually be traced back hundreds of years. The French had laid claim to much of North America through a series of inland explorations and trading expeditions. The first French explorer to reach the Great Lakes was Etienne Biardelot and Ilouyou, and the first French settlement in the interior was established at Fort Niagara in 1626. But the real catalyst for the war was the fur trade. As the demand for furs in Europe increased, so did the competition between the French and British for control of the interior. The French concentrated their efforts in the Great Lakes region, while the British focused on the Appalachian frontier. And that brings us back to the Forks of the Ohio and the two rival forts built there by the French and British. In 1753, the French governor of Canada sent a force of 300 men to expel the British from the Ohio Valley. The following year, the British and Native Americans attempted to intercept them. They attacked the French troops at the Battle of Jumonville-Glynn and killed or captured nearly every one of them. News of the massacre reached the French court, and they began mobilizing for war. By 1755, the French and their Native American allies had taken control of the Ohio Valley and defeated the British at the Battle of the Monongahela. The British then retreated to Virginia, where they were eventually forced to surrender. So things had exactly been peaceful in North America, leading up to 1754. There had been skirmishes and battles between the French, British, and Native Americans for decades. But the war in 1754 was something different. It was more organized and more intense than any previous conflict between the two powers. The French and Indian War was not just a small skirmish in the woods. It was a full-scale war that would have global consequences. That is, because the war in North America was part of a larger conflict known as the 7 Years' War. The 7 Years' War was fought between the same powers as the French and Indian War, but it took place in Europe, Asia, and Africa as well. The war was essentially a global struggle for power between the two dominant European empires of the 18th century, the British and French. The French had long dominated much of Europe and was still a major player in North America. The British, meanwhile, had emerged as a new power on the scene. They had a strong naval presence and a growing network of colonies in North America. As the two powers clashed over territory in North America, they also competed for control of strategic locations around the world. The French, for example, held key strategic positions in the Caribbean and in India. The British, meanwhile, had a strong presence in South Africa and in Canada. As the war in North America intensified, so did the fighting elsewhere. The British and French battled each other on the high seas, in the jungles of India, and on the plains of Africa. And as the war dragged on, the stakes became higher and higher. For the French, the war was essentially a fight for survival. If they lost, their empire would collapse, and they would be left with nothing. The British, meanwhile, were fighting to maintain their dominance. They wanted to keep their empire intact, and to continue their economic and political dominance of the world. As the war raged on, the two sides would draw in more and more resources and manpower. The French would rely heavily on their Native American allies, while the British would attempt to build a stronger navy and army. And as the war dragged on, the fighting would become more and more brutal. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's return to North America and see how the French and Indian War got started. With the British defeat at the Battle of the Monongahela, the French and their Native American allies controlled most of the Ohio Valley. But the British were far from finished. The following year, 1755, the British sent General Edward Braddock to lead a force of 2,000 men into the Ohio Valley. Braddock's mission was simple: capture Fort Duquesne and expel the French from the region. But Braddock was inexperienced, and his troops were poorly trained. On top of that, the terrain was unfamiliar, and the British were constantly harassed by Native American fighters. On July 9, 1755, Braddock's forces attacked the fort, but were repelled with heavy losses. Braddock himself was killed, and his force was in complete disarray. The battle was a disaster for the British, and it convinced them that they needed to take a different approach to the war. Instead of relying on large armies and conventional tactics, the British began to use smaller, more mobile forces to harass the French. This proved to be a much more effective strategy, and the British were soon able to drive the French back. Over the next few years, the war would continue to intensify. Both sides would commit more resources to the conflict, and the fighting would become more and more brutal. But that's a story for another time. For now, let's just say that the French and Indian War was just getting started. So what do you think? What are your predictions for the war? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and leave a review. Thank you for watching. Narrator. So at this point, if you're paying attention, you're saying to yourself, wait a second, I know those guys were fighting each other back in Europe, and now they coming over here to North America and they're going to fight each other again. Yes, that's exactly what's happening. Welcome to Chapter 2 of the second episode of the series, wherein we talk about old rivals in a new world. Okay, so let's do some quick review of what we talked about last time. In our first episode, we talked about how the French and the British were big rivals in Europe. They also fought each other in Ireland, and then they started coming over here to North America, because there was money to be made, and when they came over here, They brought all their old rivalries with them. Now, that's not unique to these two countries, by the way. Like, people bring their baggage with them wherever they go. It's just part of being human. So these guys bring their baggage over here. Now, it's important to remember, though, that although France and Britain are rivals, they're not the only European powers looking to get in on this whole North American thing. Spain is still a major player. The Dutch are showing up as well. And Portugal, even though they don't have any land in North America, they're still hanging around because they've got a big trading network here. So this is a pretty crowded place, especially when you consider that there are already a bunch of different native nations living here as well. So what we're gonna do in this chapter is look at a few different places where these two old rivals meet up here in North America and see what happens when they do. Before we get into it, I just want to say thank you to all of you who have subscribed to the channel. If you haven't done that yet, I would really appreciate it. And with that said, let's get to it. Okay, so the first place we're going to look at is Canada. Now, when we talked about the French exploration of North America, we saw that they started to build some forts and trading posts up there. And the British, meanwhile, were concentrating on building their own coastal colonies. In particular, they had one at Newfoundland and another one at Nova Scotia. These are both places where the French had also tried to set up shop, but they couldn't really compete with the British there. So they gave up and moved farther west. This meant that for a while, the French and the British kind of stayed out of each other's way. The French were up in Canada, and the British were down in the south. But that wasn't necessarily a good thing, right? Because if you're the British, you're looking at the French up in Canada and thinking, hey, those guys are getting in the way of our empire building. Or if you're the French, you might be looking at the British down in the south and thinking the same exact thing. So eventually, these two groups are going to come into conflict with each other. But before we get into that, I should mention that there is a lot more going on here than just two Europeans fighting each other. And that's because these two groups both have allies among the natives in this region. And in both cases, it's actually a pretty delicate alliance. Now, in particular, the French are relying heavily on the Huron people in this region. But the Huron people aren't a single group. They're actually an alliance of several different nations who are united against a common enemy, which in this case is the Iroquois Confederacy. The Iroquois Confederacy is a big deal. They're made up of 5 different nations, and they're one of the largest and most powerful groups of nations in all of North America. That makes them a little bit intimidating, and it also makes them a little bit dangerous. And that's why the French are so happy to have the Huron people on their side. Meanwhile, the British are allied with the Iroquois, so now we've got 2 powerful groups of natives fighting on behalf of the Europeans. And that's just the situation that existed before the French and the British ever met. In fact, things will get much worse when they do meet, because at this point, the French and the British start fighting each other for influence in the region. And that means that they're also fighting on behalf of their native allies as well. So that's kind of a weird situation, because if you the British and you're fighting the French, you're also fighting the Huron, even though at this point you've never really interacted with them. You're just doing it because your rival is allied with them. And the same thing goes for the French. They're fighting your allies. So, this is a pretty volatile situation, you can probably imagine. And it only gets worse when the French start sending more people into the interior. And that's going to happen because, as we talked about in the last episode, the French realized that they couldn't compete with the British along the coast. So they're going to try to move farther inland. And one of the reasons they want to do this is because they're hearing rumors that their SAC route through the Great Lakes and into the Mississippi River Valley. If that's true, then they could have a direct route from the Gulf of Mexico all the way up to the Atlantic Ocean. That would be amazing. So the French start exploring this area, and they're also competing with the British for land and resources. But it's hard for them to do that because, like we said, the Iroquois are not very happy about the French being here. And they keep attacking the French forts and trading posts. Now, the French, meanwhile, are trying to defend themselves, but they're also trying to stay true to their mission, which is to basically not get into a big war with the natives. And that's difficult because the natives are constantly attacking them. So it's hard to avoid a war when you're being attacked. Eventually, the French will decide that the only option they have is to go to war with the Iroquois. And that will kick off a series of conflicts known as the French and Indian Wars. Now, don't worry. We're going to spend a lot of time talking about those wars in future episodes. So if you want to learn more about them, just stay tuned. Okay, so let's look at another place where these old rivals meet. And this time, we're going to go down to New England. New England is at this point a collection of different colonies, but it's mostly under the control of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and the leaders of that colony are very interested in expanding their territory. The problem is they bumping up against the land of a group of natives known as the Pequot. Now, the Pequot aren't exactly thrilled about having these English interlopers on their land. But the English have been there for a while at this point, so the Pequot are looking for a new ally, and they find one in the Dutch. Now, the Dutch are very interested in creating good relations with the native peoples of North America. Because they do even have a lot of people here. They're mostly relying on trade to make money, and in order to do that, they need the help of the natives. Meanwhile, the English are doing the opposite. They're bringing a lot of settlers here, and they're not always respectful of the native lands or the native way of life. That means that at this point, the Dutch are very dependent on the natives, whereas the English are not. And that puts them in a weird position, because if the Dutch are allied with the natives, and the English are enemies of the natives, then that means the Dutch and the English are now enemies of each other. And that's exactly what happens. There are a number of different conflicts between the English and the Dutch in this region, but the biggest one is known as the Anglo-Dutch War. Now, this isn't a war that happens in North America exclusively. It's also happening in Europe, in Africa, and in the Caribbean. But in North America, the war is fought largely over control of the fur trade. Now, both sides have their own areas where they're based. The Dutch are concentrated in the area around present-day New York City, whereas the English are up in Canada and in New England. But because the war is happening everywhere else as well, the fighting is relatively intense in North America. The Dutch managed to hold on to most of their territory in North America, but they're not really able to expand anymore either, and that is a huge disappointment to them because they're re-surrounded by the English, and they're not able to grow, so they end up selling their North American territories to the English. So that's the end of the Dutch presence in North America, at least for now. The English, meanwhile, are very pleased with themselves, because they're basically surrounding the French up in Canada, and if they wanted to, they could probably just take all of that territory. But they're not ready for that quite yet. So instead, they're going to focus on expanding their own territory and on fighting the French in other parts of the world. And that's the story of Chapter 2. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to the channel and leave me a comment below with your thoughts on the matter. Thank you so much for watching. Alright, it's time for Chapter 3. The Spark and the Ohio Valley. And here we see that there are two great empires in North America. One British, one French. And they are fighting over this area right here, the Ohio Valley. Why is it so important? Well, it's not about gold or God. We've got plenty of both places. It's about fur and fertile land. You see, the entire Ohio Valley was covered in fur-bearing animals, and the fertile soil made it perfect for farming. And boy, do both France and Britain want it. Now, France has been in the Ohio Valley since 1700 when they established the fortress of Presque Isle on the Detroit River. But ever since then, competition with the British colonies has grown fiercer. Remember, these British colonies are growing like crazy due to the increased flow of immigrants from Europe, and those immigrants need land to farm and raise their families on. Land speculators in Virginia, like the Ohio Company, are eager to push the frontier ever westward into what the natives call the Ohio Valley, but the French have other plans. In 1748, the French government passed the Edict of Reshaped, which outlawed any fur trading within the boundaries of their empire without a license from the government. This was an attempt by the French government to reassert control over the valuable fur trade. You see, the Ohio Valley was a hotbed for smuggling and illicit activity. Because the French had failed to establish any real settlements out here, they had just a few small trading posts, the closest one being at Vienna. That's why the Ohio Company sent young George Washington to go and tell the French to buzz off. See, back in 1753, George Washington was a 21-year-old former surveyor who was looking to get his career in land speculation started, and he also happened to be a British subject. He accepted the mission from the Ohio Company to go to Fort LeBoeuf and demand that the French leave the Ohio Valley. Despite being only 21 years old, he was actually quite qualified for this mission. See, Washington had been in the area before. In fact, in 1748, he led a survey team into the Ohio Valley and mapped out much of the area, so he wasn't going in blind. Plus, as a young man, he was eager to prove himself. He set out in the fall of 1753 with a small group of men and traveled down the Potomac River to its headwaters, near present-day Pittsburgh. From there, they went by land through rugged terrain to reach the French fort at Lake Erie. Washington knew that he couldn't force the French to leave peacefully, but he hoped to intimidate them enough to make them think twice about staying. So he gave them a letter from the Ohio Company outlining their demands. Then he waited for their response. Well, the French commander at the fort was a man named Pierre Joseph de Chateau ou Monsieur de Boudin, and he was actually kind of a big deal in the French colonial administration. He received many important missions from the French government, including the edict we talked about earlier, and he had been in the area for many years and knew it very well. So he was not easily intimidated. You see, the French had built Fort Leboeuf in 1752 on the same site as a former British trading post called Van, and they had done so with the knowledge and permission of the local Native American tribes. In fact, the tribes were allies of the French and provided them with valuable assistance in the fur trade. So as far as de Chartier was concerned, he was well within his rights to be there. When he read the letter from the Ohio Company, he basically told George Washington to piss off. He said that the Ohio Valley was part of New France and that the French had no intention of leaving. Washington was furious, but he knew that he couldn't do anything about it. He was outnumbered and outgunned, and it would be foolish to try and fight his way out. So he did the only thing he could do. He turned around and went home. On his way back, though, he decided to stop at the British fort of Presqu'Isle to let them know what had happened. There, he met with the British Lieutenant Governor, Charles Lawrence, and told him all about de Chartier and the French fort at Lake Erie. Now, Lawrence was not happy to hear this, but he also knew that he couldn't do anything about it. He didn't have enough troops to launch an invasion of New France and take back the Ohio Valley. But he did see an opportunity to at least stop the French from expanding any further. So he decided to send George Washington back to Fort Leboeuf with a new mission. This time, he wanted Washington to ask the French again to leave the Ohio Valley peacefully. If they refused, then Washington was to return to Virginia and report back to the governor there. Washington was not happy about this, but he knew that he didn't really have a choice. He needed the British colonial government to support his efforts if he was going to do anything about the French presence in the Ohio Valley. And right now, all they were willing to do was send him back to try and negotiate. So he did. But this time, he brought along a military escort of 40 men. Now, this was still nowhere near enough to launch an invasion of New France, but it would at least give him some protection if things went south. Washington arrived back at Fort Leboeuf in the summer of 1754 and demanded that the French leave the Ohio Valley. De Chartier refused again, and Washington, with his 40 men, was not in a position to do anything about it. Washington decided to march back to Presqu'Isle, but on the way, his men spotted a detachment of French soldiers coming towards them. Washington knew that he had to do something to protect his men, so he ordered them to dig in and form a defensive line. The two sides prepared for battle, and for a moment, it looked like the British might be able to win a victory against the French. But then the rain came. It poured down in torrents, making the ground muddy and slippery. The cannons couldn't be fired, and the muskets wouldn't hold together. The battle was effectively over. Washington and his men retreated to Presqu'Isle and reported back to the colonial government. And now the British were finally convinced that they needed to take action. They sent out a force of 600 men under the command of General Edward Braddock to drive the French out of the Ohio Valley once and for all. Braddock's force was made up of British regulars, colonial militia, and a group of men led by none other than George Washington. Washington had come a long way since his first mission to Fort Leboeuf. He was no longer the inexperienced young man who had to meekly ask the French to leave. Now, he was a seasoned veteran who had tasted battle and was eager for more, and he would get it in spades. You see, General Braddock marched his men to the east of Fort Leboeuf in an effort to catch the French by surprise, but he quickly found that the terrain was impassable, and he was forced to turn back. In the end, Braddock's force was defeated by a smaller French force. Braddock himself was killed, and Washington was forced to flee. The defeat was a humiliating one for the British, and it made it clear that they were in for a long and bloody war. The struggle for the Ohio Valley had begun, and neither the British nor the French were willing to back down. All right, class, that is it for Chapter 3. Next time, we will talk about how the war between the French and the British goes. It is so important to understand how we got to this point. How we got to the spark in the Ohio Valley. If you want a review for next time, check out the Chapter 3 review packet. There are links to all the videos you need to watch and all the pages you need to read in the textbook. If you want me to keep making these videos, express your undying gratitude by clicking that subscribe button and leaving me a comment telling me what you think. I love reading your comments. Alright, class dismissed. Chapter 4, Jumonville Glen and the First Shots. In this episode, we're going to look at the Battle of Jumonville Glen, where George Washington's party ambushed and killed a French force, including the man the Glen is named for. We'll see how this small affair would have massive diplomat repercussions and lead to the construction of Fort Necessity and Washington's first surrender in the French and Indian War. Welcome to the channel. And just a reminder before we get started, if you enjoy these episodes, hop on over to our support page. On May 28, 1754, a detachment of British regulars under the command of Lieutenant James Mackay was marching through the woods near Jumonville Glen in western Pennsylvania. Their objective was to reach the Ohio River and establish a fort there. They were accompanied by a group of Virginia militia led by the recently appointed Major George Washington. Washington, who had no previous military training or experience, was given command of the expedition because he was the highest-ranking officer present. The main body of troops was being followed by a baggage train carrying supplies and equipment. This train was being harassed by a group of French-Canadian hunters and traders who felt that the British presence in the Ohio Valley threatened their way of life. The French had been living and trading in this region for decades and viewed the British incursion as a violation of their long-standing claim to the area. On May, Mackay decided to halt the march and send a party under Washington to find and punish the French responsible for the harassment. There is some debate about exactly what orders Mackay gave Washington. However, the orders were clearly to use force, if necessary, to stop the harassment and to capture or kill any hostile natives encountered. As Washington moved forward with his party, they came across a small group of French soldiers and one civilian who were repairing a gundalo. One of the soldiers quickly ran off into the trees, but the others were captured. The prisoners included Joseph Cowlin de Jumonville, a French officer, and another armed man. Washington questioned them about the harassment of the baggage train, but they denied any involvement. They claimed they were traveling to Fort Duquesne to deliver presents to the British garrison there. As Washington prepared to release the prisoners, Jumonville attempted to draw his sword and attack him, and a scuffle ensued. During the struggle, Jumonville was shot and killed by one of Washington's men. The other French soldiers and the civilian were also killed in the fighting. Washington, however, claimed that only he and Jumonville had drawn their swords and that Jumonville had attacked him first. Washington then led his party to Jumonville's body and scalped him. He ordered the head cut off and hung from the bowsprit of the ship that had transported them to this point as a warning to other would-be attackers. Although the fight was over, the situation was far from settled. News of the confrontation spread quickly through the Ohio Valley and tensions between the British and French rose. The French governor in Canada, the Marquis de Montcalm, demanded that the British commander in the region, Sir William Johnson, hand over Washington for trial for murder. Johnson refused, claiming that the incident occurred outside of his jurisdiction. This refusal led to diplomatic protests and threats of war between the two powers. Meanwhile, Washington returned to Virginia, where he was celebrated as a hero. However, his victory at Jumonville Glen was short-lived. He soon found himself in command of Fort Necessity, which was under siege by a force of French regulars and colonial militia. On September 3, 1754, a force of around 500 French and Indian troops arrived at the confluence of the Monongahela and Allegheny rivers and began constructing a fort, which they named Fort Duquesne. The British, aware of the fort's construction, dispatched 3 separate forces to destroy it. The first 2 were defeated, but the third, known as the Braddock Expedition, managed to reach the fort. Unfortunately, the force, which consisted of around 1,200 men, was not prepared for the rugged terrain and thick undergrowth of the area. They moved slowly and were easily tracked by a detachment of French scouts. On top of these, their experienced officers failed to take charge and assert themselves. When the British force came within range of the fort, the French opened fire from behind their strong fortifications and picked off the British officers and men at will. The inexperienced British officers were unable to effectively respond, and the entire force was gradually wiped out. Those who survived the massacre retreated into the forest, where they were pursued by French troops. Many were killed or captured, and the rest fled to different directions. One of the officers who survived the battle was George Washington, who had taken command of a company of Virginians after the death of the previous commander, Colonel Thomas Shirley. During the battle, Washington, who was an inexperienced leader, retreated with his men to a place called the Meadows, where they joined up with a force of around 200 militia under the command of Colonel John Byng. Together, they formed a small camp surrounded by dense undergrowth. Byng, like many of the other British commanders during this war, had little military experience and was reluctant to attack the entrenched French. Washington, on the other hand, believed that the time had come to take action against the French. He argued that the militia would soon be going home, and that the regulars needed to make a stand or risk losing all hope of defeating the French. After several days of arguing with his superiors, Washington was given permission to scout the French position. He chose a spot near the Monongahela River that was concealed by thick undergrowth. His plan was to attack the French early in the morning, while they were still asleep. At dawn on October 2nd, 1754, Washington's force set out from camp and moved toward the river. As they approached the French position, Washington ordered his men to prepare to attack. At a signal, they would rush forward and engage the French in hand-to-hand combat. As they crept closer to the river, Washington signaled his men to charge by firing his own musket into the air. A shout went up from the men as they rushed out of the undergrowth and charged toward the French lines. However, their attack was poorly coordinated and did not catch the French by surprise. The French soldiers had been alerted to the attack and were ready for the coming assault. They fired upon the charging British, inflicting heavy casualties. Washington's men fell back, reforming and attempting to flank the French position, but they were driven back again by the superior numbers and firepower of the French. The battle lasted only about 15 minutes, and when it was over, Washington's force had suffered heavy losses. Of the 266 men who had charged the French lines, 42 were killed and 111 wounded. In addition, 69 men deserted rather than face the oncoming French attack. With their attack having failed, Washington and the surviving members of his command retreated to the Meadows, where they surrendered to the French commander, Louis de Ville. The terms of the surrender allowed the British officers to keep their sidearms and personal belongings, as well as one field piece. The British soldiers were allowed to return home with their muskets, and the French agreed to supply them with food until they reached their nearest settlement. It wasn't until October 26 that Washington and his men finally reached a British post near Pittsburgh. They were exhausted and demoralized after weeks of campaigning and struggling to survive in the wilderness. So in the aftermath of this battle, Fort Necessity was abandoned and the British were forced to retreat from the Ohio Valley. As we already mentioned, George Washington became something of a hero after the battle, despite losing it. His account of the battle, written in a letter to the President of Virginia, downplayed his own role in the conflict and emphasized the bravery of his men. He also made sure to emphasize the fact that the French had violated the rules of civilized warfare by scalping and mutilating the bodies of slain British soldiers. This version of events was widely accepted in Virginia and helped to secure Washington's reputation as a military leader. However, the defeat at Fort Necessity was a bitter pill to swallow for the proud Virginians. They were eager to prove themselves in battle, and the humiliating defeat at Fort Duquesne had left them demoralized. Fortunately, the French were unable to capitalize on their victory. They were short on supplies and did not have the resources to mount a large-scale campaign in the Ohio Valley. This allowed the British to regroup and prepare for a new offensive. We're going to talk about that next time. But for now, I just want to say thanks for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. And with that, I'm gone. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this episode, check out my podcast available on various platforms. So today we're going to talk about Chapter 5, which is titled Native Nations, Strategic Allies, and Sovereign Powers. Now, I am really excited to get into this chapter because it covers a topic that is often overlooked in world history surveys, and it's the agency and autonomy of indigenous peoples in North America during the colonial era. So let's get started. Okay, so let's begin with the big takeaway for this chapter. Okay, during this period, the various native nations of North America, they were not passive victims of European colonialism. Instead, They acted strategically to preserve their autonomy and independence. So they did this by playing the Europeans against one another, and by adapting European models to their own needs. Okay, now let's go ahead and get to know our first key term, which is the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, the Iroquois Confederacy, also known as the Grand Council of Chiefs, or the League of the Five Nations, was an alliance of several related tribes in the Great Lakes region. So this included the Mohawk, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca nations. And La Terre de Tuscarora would also join the League. And what these five nations had in common was that they spoke related languages. They shared similar cultures, and they all lived in the Great Lakes region. But this alliance, though it wasn't just based on shared characteristics, it was also solidified through a constitution that established a central government, which at the time was pretty unique. I mean, think back to the period in Europe from which most of these guys came and how fragmented it was politically. You had all these little kingdoms and dukedoms and whatnot, and then you had the Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't even that unified. But meanwhile, these guys over here, they had a constitution establishing a central government, and so this constitution, it created a grand council composed of representatives from each nation, and decisions required the consensus of all parties, and the council's authority was limited to matters of war and peace, so that was pretty unique for the time period. They also had a constitution, although I will say that the great peacemaker is kind of shrouded in myth and legend. So there's not a lot of hard historical evidence that we can point to and say, yep, this dude wrote it, we've got it right here. But according to tradition, he was a great chief who went around the region, and he persuaded the nations to join together in peace and form the Confederacy. And according to tradition, he did this by putting together the Constitution and then presenting it to them as a gift. But the great peacemaker, his efforts did have some long-lasting consequences, because the Iroquois Confederacy became the most powerful and influential alliance of Native American tribes in the eastern woodlands. And so, let's go ahead and talk about why they were so powerful. So, part of their power base, it was geographical. I mean, they controlled the waterways of the Great Lakes region, which allowed them to expand their influence over a large area, and they could easily travel throughout the region. But they also dominated the fur trade, which made them wealthy and which also gave them leverage over the Europeans. So let's talk about that for a minute. The fur trade, it played a major role in the early colonial period, and it was a vital economic activity for both the natives and the Europeans. And so the Iroquois Confederacy, they controlled the most valuable resource, which was beaver pelts. And so they used this control to gain an advantage over the Europeans. I mean, when the French arrived in the colonial era, they desperately needed the Iroquois' help to survive. I mean, they didn't have the resources to live off the land. They didn't have the skills to do so, and so they needed the Iroquois' help in order to survive. And so the French, they depended on the Iroquois for food and for guides and for their very survival in the wilderness. Meanwhile, the Dutch and the English, they had more difficulty establishing relationships with the Iroquois. The Iroquois, they viewed the English as a threat, and they didn't trust them. And so when the English came along, the Iroquois, they began to ally themselves with the French, so they tried to use the Europeans against one another. And the Iroquois strategy was very effective, because during the French and Indian War, the Iroquois Confederacy, they sided with the British and the colonists against the French, and their military alliance with the British proved to be decisive in securing victory for them. And as a result, they received recognition of their sovereignty from the British, and they were able to retain their lands and independence. However, after the war, things began to shift, and the Iroquois Confederacy, they began to break up. So the traditional story goes that after the war, the American Revolution happened, and the Iroquois Confederacy broke up over the issue of whether or not they should side with the Americans or the British. But if you want the nuanced version, well, here it is. So it's true that the American Revolution caused a split within the Iroquois Confederacy, but it wasn't as simple as just two sides. In reality, it was more like four sides. So during the war, the Iroquois divided into two factions, those who supported the Patriots and those who supported the British. And so those who supported the Patriots, they were led by the Onondaga and the Tuscarora nations. Meanwhile, those who sided with the British were led by the Mohawk and the Seneca nations. And then you also had the Cayuga and the Onondaga who were kind of split down the middle. But what's interesting about this conflict is that it wasn't just a political dispute. It was also deeply personal and emotional for many of the Iroquois people. For example, there was a famous case where two brothers from the Onondaga Nation found themselves on opposing sides of the war. One brother fought for the Patriots and the other fought for the British. And during a battle, they ended up killing each other. And so this illustrates that this was not simply a political divide, but it was a very deep divide for these people. And this conflict, it contributed to the decline of the Iroquois Confederacy. Because once the war was over, the British didn't honor their promises to the Iroquois people, and instead they seized their lands and forced them to move west. Okay, so while we're talking about the Iroquois, let me go ahead and introduce you to a second key term, which is the Huron. And the Huron, they are also known as the Wendat, or the Tia. And they were an Algonquian-speaking people who lived in what is today southern Ontario and Quebec. And in terms of their culture, they were organized into several smaller villages. They had a strong tradition of art and craftsmanship, especially with their totem poles and their birch bark canoes. But the Huron, they had a complex relationship with the Iroquois, and it started out okay, but then it got bad. So initially, the Huron and the Iroquois had good relations. They traded with each other. They were both part of the larger eastern woodland culture, and they got along pretty well. However, competition over resources, particularly the fur trade, eventually led to conflict between the two groups. And the Huron, they were allied with the French, and the Iroquois were allied with the British. And so when the French and Indian War broke out, the Huron were caught in the middle. And as a result, the Iroquois attacked the Huron villages and destroyed them. So they killed many of the Huron people and they captured many others. And they forced them to flee to the north. And so those who escaped, they fled to present-day Michigan and Wisconsin. And there they formed new villages and they rebuilt their lives. But sadly, most of the Huron people perished. Okay, so moving away from the Iroquois for a minute, let's talk about another key term, which is the Aben and the Abenaki were an Algonquin-speaking people who lived in what is today Maine and New Hampshire, and they were known for their skill as hunters and their close ties to the natural world. But unlike the Huron, the Abenaki were able to avoid large-scale violence with the Europeans. But the Abenaki were completely free of European influence, because they adapted some European practices to their own needs. For example, they adopted the use of firearms, and they used this to their advantage, because it helped them in their conflicts with the Iroquois, and it also helped them in their trade networks. Additionally, the Abenaki maintained a degree of autonomy through diplomacy, so they played the Europeans against each other, much like the Iroquois did, and they used this to maintain their independence. For example, during the French and Indian War, the Abenaki sided with the French, and they provided them with food and supplies. But as the war drew to a close and they realized that the British were winning, the Abenaki switched sides, and they sided with the British. And so they were able to adapt to the changing political circumstances, and this helped them to preserve their autonomy. Okay, so let's wrap up this chapter with a discussion of one last key term, which is the Delaware. And the Delaware were also known as the Lenni Lenape, and they were an Algonquian-speaking people who lived in what is today the northeastern United States, and they were known for their skill as farmers and their close ties to the land. But as the chapter explains, the Delaware, they faced a lot of challenges during this period. So the pressure from the Iroquois, the encroachment of European settlers onto their lands, and then also diseases brought over from Europe devastated their populations. And so as a result, the Delaware, they were forced to abandon their homelands and move west. But despite these challenges, the Delaware, they still sought to preserve their autonomy and independence. So to that end, they adopted some European practices such as farming, and they also used diplomacy to play the Europeans against one another. For example, during the French and Indian War, the Delaware sided with the French, and they provided them with food and supplies. And this was partly due to their long-standing alliance with the French, but it was also due to their animosity toward the British. So the Delaware had a long history of conflict with the British, and they distrusted them. And so when the opportunity arose to side with the French, they jumped at it. Alright, so let's finish up by talking about why all this stuff happened. Why did the Europeans allow the native nations to do all this stuff? Well, let's talk about 3 reasons. Number 1, the Europeans, They underestimated the intelligence and the sophistication of the native peoples. I mean, European ethnocentrism was off the charts at the time, and so they thought that the natives were just like children who couldn't really understand politics. So they thought they could just fool them or manipulate them really easily. But the natives, they were actually quite savvy. And they were able to play the Europeans against one another and use them to their advantage.
No. Two, the Europeans.
They were often distracted by their own conflicts with one another, and so this gave the native peoples some space to breathe and to maneuver. For example, during the French and Indian War, the Europeans were so focused on fighting each other that they didn't really pay much attention to the native peoples. And this allowed the native peoples to make some significant gains in terms of preserving their autonomy and their independence. And number three, the Europeans. They often didn't realize that the native peoples were united. I mean, the Europeans, they always assumed that the native peoples would be easy to divide and conquer, and so they thought that they could turn the natives against each other and use them to their advantage. But the natives were often more united than the Europeans expected, and this made it difficult for the Europeans to defeat the natives militarily, and also to control them politically. Okay, click right here to keep reviewing for Unit 3, and don't forget to subscribe. The French and Indian War had revealed the weakness of the British North American colonies. They were disjointed and unprepared for conflict, and while they had some military success against the French and their Native American allies, it was not enough to satisfy the colonists that their defense was secure. But in the aftermath of the war, one important thing did happen that would have an enormous impact on the future of the colonies. They came together like never before and created a plan for a unified government over all of the colonies. This is Chapter 6 of our American History series, and we begin our story in 1754 with a meeting held in Albany, New York, where delegates from 7 of the northern colonies met. Now, this meeting is known today as the Albany Congress, but at the time it was just called the Congress of the United Colonies of New England, and that name reveals the purpose of their gathering. These 7 colonies still considered themselves separate political entities, but they wanted to form a closer bond due to the ongoing conflict with the French and their Native American allies. The delegates who attended the Congress were from Connecticut, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and Providence Plantations, New Hampshire, New York, Pennsylvania, and Virginia. Notice that Maryland was conspicuously absent, along with most of the southern colonies. In fact, it wasn't until 1767 that a southern colony sent a delegate to an intercolonial congress. As we can say, these meetings didn't really pick up steam until much later, and there are a number of reasons for this. For one thing, the delegates to these meetings had to pay their own way to get there, so it was more of a burden on those colonies that were located further north, because travel was easier and cheaper. Plus, Southerners were quite content with the amount of autonomy they already had within the empire. They weren't interested in giving up any more power to a centralized authority. Still, in 1754, the delegates met in Albany and drew up a list of grievances against the British and French governments, and then petitioned the king for certain rights that would help them defend themselves against outside threats. In particular, they asked for the right to elect their own governors and for freedom from British interference in colonial affairs. But King George II was not interested in granting any more power to the colonies. He was already wary of their growing power and wealth, and he feared that if he gave them more autonomy, they might eventually rebel. So he denied their request and went ahead with his plan to reassert control over the colonies by taxing them. In response to the increased taxes and other forms of imperial control, the colonists grew angrier and began looking for ways to resist. One of the most famous examples of colonial resistance during this period was the creation of the Join, or Die cartoon by Benjamin Franklin in 1754. The cartoon depicted a snake divided into 8 pieces, each representing one of the colonies, with the words Join or Die written across the image. It was published in the Pennsylvania Gazette and quickly became one of the most iconic images of the era. Today, it's become synonymous with the American Revolution, which is a bit odd, since Franklin actually created the cartoon to urge the colonies to unite under British rule. That's because, although the Albany Congress had failed in its goal of achieving greater autonomy, Franklin and others continued to believe that colonial unity was essential if they were going to survive in North America. But Franklin's vision of colonial unity differed from that of the Albany Congress. He didn't want the colonies to be united under a separate colonial government. Instead, he wanted them to be united under the British Crown. But even Franklin would eventually come to realize that the colonies could never truly be united under British rule. Each colony had developed its own distinct culture and identity, and the people of each colony had grown accustomed to governing themselves. Even if they could put aside their differences and unite under a single colonial government, the British would never allow it. So in 1767, when delegates from 7 colonies met in Albany for the second time, they did so knowing that true unity was impossible. Still, they wanted to try, and this time, their goal was to draft a plan for a unified colonial government that could then be presented to the king. The result of their efforts was the Albany Plan of Union, which proposed a new government for the colonies, consisting of a Grand Council made up of representatives from each colony. The Grand Council would have the power to levy taxes, raise an army, and make laws for the colonies. However, the plan also provided for a President General who would be appointed by the king to oversee the government and ensure that it did not become too powerful. The President General would have the power to veto any laws that the Grand Council passed, as well as the power to appoint colonial governors and judges. So while the Albany Plan did create a unified government for the colonies, it also ensured that the British would retain ultimate control over them. Naturally, the plan was submitted to King George II, but as you might expect, he wasn't very receptive to the idea. Like most absolute monarchs, he was not interested in sharing power with anyone, not even with a group of loyal subjects in faraway colonies. So he rejected the Albany Plan and went ahead with his plan to tighten control over the colonies by imposing taxes and other restrictions. But this time, the colonies were better prepared to resist. The Albany Plan had helped them to see the benefits of unity, and they were now more willing than ever to stand up to the British. The increased tensions between the colonies and Great Britain set the stage for the next chapter in American history, the American Revolution. We'll talk about that next time. Before we go, I want to remind you that you can find additional resources for this video, including a full timeline of events and a list of recommended books and articles. Just go to our website and click on the logo in the top right corner. I also invite you to subscribe to our channel. We're on a mission to make history more engaging and accessible for everyone, and we hope that you'll join us on that mission by subscribing to our channel and becoming part of our community. Finally, I want to say thank you. Thank you for watching this video and supporting our work. We're a small team of historians, and we're grateful for the support of our viewers. So thank you again. We'll see you next time. A quick note to teachers and homeschoolers. If you're using our videos in your classroom or homeschool, you can find additional resources such as lesson plans and quizzes on our website. Also, if you'd like to receive updates on new videos and other exciting news, be sure to sign up for our email list. We include a link in the description below. Thanks again for watching, and we'll see you next time. Chapter 7. The War Expands, 1755 to 1756. So at the end of our last episode, we found Edward Braddock leading his British regulars through the wilderness toward Fort Duquesne, and there to meet him was the French commander, the Marquis de... But unlike Braddock, Montcalm had actually read the terrain, and he knew that it would be nearly impossible for Braddock to navigate his troops through the thick undergrowth with all of their supplies and baggage. So instead of meeting him in open battle where Braddock wanted it, Montcalm had chosen 3 natural forts along the route to construct 3 separate ambushes. And these were ambushes that Braddock would walk right into. It was July 9th, 1755, when the first of the British soldiers spotted the French fortifications along the riverbank and began firing on them. At once, the British officers ordered their men to fix bayonets and charge. They attacked the first 2 French positions and hastily drove the surprised French soldiers out of their trenches and into the forest. Then they pressed on to the 3rd and final line of defense, which turned out to be empty, and so they continued on their way to Duquesne, believing the fight to be over. But as they entered the little village, they were met by a heavy crossfire from the forest. They'd walked right into another French ambush. The British officers quickly realized that their only hope was to retreat back to the most recent of their abandoned camps, but the French were having none of that. They pursued the fleeing British relentlessly, killing hundreds until finally, seeing that the game was up, Braddock gathered what remained of his men and charged the French lines. They broke and ran, allowing the survivors to fall back to safety. When the smoke cleared, the British had lost more than half of their entire force, including Braddock himself, who took a musket ball full of Huron lead right in the backside and died. And word of the disaster spread like wildfire throughout the British colonies. In New England, people panicked that an Indian horde was sweeping down from the north. In Pennsylvania, the governor's council fled the city of Philadelphia for the frontier town of Lancaster, fearing that they might soon be next. And along the frontier, thousands of settlers abandoned their homes and fled west or south or east, anywhere but where they were. In fact, by the end of the year, every single British post in the Ohio Valley had been evacuated, except for Fort Pitt, which was renamed Fort Duquesne. Once again, but just as people in the colonies were beginning to calm down and prepare to defend themselves against the coming French invasion, a royal proclamation arrived from King George forbidding any and all hostilities against the French, even though the French were the ones who had started the war. See, the thing is, while the French were building forts and fighting battles and sending colonists packing along the Ohio River, the British government hadn't officially declared war on the French. That was because, according to the king's advisors, such a move could risk angering the Spanish, who are also the king's subjects. Since the Spanish controlled the vast majority of North America west of the Mississippi River, and besides, they said, the Ohio Valley wasn't really worth getting into a war with France over, especially if it meant losing the support of Spain. This was a huge blow to the colonial governors, who felt like they'd been given the responsibility to defend their lands from French aggression, but had been explicitly forbidden from doing anything about it. But the British public largely agreed with the king's decision. After all, it was an expensive business to wage war, and what good would come of it? France was an important trading partner, and there was no appetite among the British populace to start cutting off their own nose, despite their face. And so for several months, things went pretty quiet in North America. The British and the French prepared for the coming conflict, but nobody fired a single shot. And then in November, something happened that would change everything. You see, while the British were quibbling with each other about whether or not they should go to war in North America, the French were busy making plans to invade. At a conference in 1754, the French Minister of Marine had noted that the time had come to choose between defending Canada and abandoning it. He pointed out that they simply didn't have enough men to do both, and so they would need to abandon one post and concentrate their forces on the other. That post was going to be Louisiana, because it was much more profitable than Canada, and besides, it was a lot closer to France. All they had to do was keep the British out of the Ohio Valley long enough for the settlers to abandon their homes and clear out. They chose the Marquis de Montcalm to lead this effort, and he got to work immediately. On June 1st, 1755, he assembled a force of 2,500 men, mostly made up of seasoned veterans, and sent them off to recapture Fort Duquesne. This was the force that Braddock's disastrous expedition had run away from, and it was led by the same French commander who had engineered the ambush. Montcalm would follow them himself in a few weeks, and for now, life in the British colonies would go back to normal, or rather, as normal as it ever was. For example, that very same month, the Virginia House Burgesses passed a law requiring that all free men carry a rifle and ammunition at all times. Then, in August, a group of British traders traveling along the Mohawk River saw a party of French traders who had been forced to flee the area around Lake Erie by the British colonial militia. A skirmish broke out, and the British traders won, killing one Frenchman and capturing the rest. By September, the Illinois country was in full-blown panic mode, as stories of French atrocities spread through the frontier settlements. And the following month, a large party of French Canadians raided a small village near Lake Ontario, killing 8 British traders and capturing 5 more, along with their goods and equipment. Then, in January of 1756, the British East India Company received word that the French had seized 2 of their ships off the coast of Africa, and on May 6, 1756, France and Britain officially declared war on each other. The 7 Years' War had begun. Now, technically, this was still the same war that had started in North America in 1754. But the significance here is that this war was being fought all over the world. Now, while some people might call this the first truly global war, that honor probably goes to the War of the Spanish Succession, which was fought in Europe, Africa, and Asia. But the 7 Years' War was certainly the first truly global war to be fought in the Americas. It's called the 7 Years' War because it lasted 7 years. Just kidding. It was actually the longest war in world history, lasting a total of 9 years. But since both sides were fighting on multiple continents, the war in North America is often referred to separately as the French and Indian War. In reality, though, the 7 Years' War was being fought everywhere all at once. But the fact that this war was being fought in the Americas is significant, because in many ways it represents a turning point in world history. For centuries, the wealth of European nations had come primarily from extracting resources from their colonies, and the colonies themselves existed solely to provide raw materials and captive markets for the manufactured goods of their parent countries. There was no such thing as a colonial economy independent of Europe, and it was generally accepted that the colonies themselves could never become wealthy. That began to change during the 18th century, however, and nowhere more so than in North America. Over the course of the century, improvements in agriculture and manufacturing had increased the population of colonial cities faster than their housing supply. So rents were high. People couldn't afford to live in the cities, so they moved out to the countryside and began farming the land. As the number of farms increased, so did the number of people working them, which in turn increased the demand for manufactured goods. And so the colonies began to develop their own economies independent of Europe, which made them more valuable to their parent countries, and it made the war to control them much more important. As the British and French armies clashed along the Ohio River, they were also fighting in Europe, Africa, and Asia. The British were fighting the French in India, for example, where the French had built a massive army and navy to challenge the British for control of the region. And they were also fighting the Spanish in Central America, where the Spanish were attempting to regain control of the Philippines, which they'd lost to the British in 1702. And they were fighting the Spanish in South America, where the Spanish viceroy of Peru attempted to raise a force of 40,000 men to capture the Panama Isthmus and send the British packing. And then there was the Holy Roman Empire, who threw their hat in the ring and joined the fray because the Emperor's brother had been passed over for the throne of France. But despite all of these conflicts taking place on multiple continents, the fate of the world hung in the balance in the Ohio Valley. If the British could keep the French from linking arms with the Native Americans and seizing control of the Ohio Valley, they would win the war. But if the French managed to hold on to the Ohio Valley, they would win the war. And the stakes couldn't have been higher. Whoever won the war would become the dominant power in North America, and they would have to contend with Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, and Russia, all vying for a piece of the pie. Next time on the Ohio Story, the British are determined to capture Fort Duquesne once and for all. But first, don't forget to stay tuned. And thank you for watching. Chapter 8, Fighting in the Wilderness and on the Seas. The year is 1779, and the American Revolutionary War is in full swing. The previous chapter saw the British evacuate Boston after besieging it for many months. Now, with the city gone, the Patriots are left to pick up the pieces and prepare for the coming British retaliation. Meanwhile, General Howe is planning his next move, one that will take him deep into the wilderness of the New World. We'll get to that in a bit, though. Right now, we need to talk about fighting in the wilderness and on the seas. But before we do, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing for more great content like this. Fighting in the wilderness was hard. Not only did troops have to contend with difficult terrain, supply lines, and guerrilla forces, but they also had to contend with the elements and wild animals. The wilderness was unforgiving, but there were advantages to be had by those who could harness its power, and many commanders understood this well. In Canada, General James Wolfe was gathering troops for an invasion of the 13 colonies. He knew that the terrain would be a problem for his army, so he planned to use the waterways to his advantage. In the summer of 1779, he led his troops down the Mohawk River, where they engaged the colonial militia in several battles. One of these engagements took place at the strategically important Fort Stanwix, which the Americans had fortified. After a long siege, Wolfe's forces captured the fort and continued their march south. They were met by British naval forces who escorted them down the Oswego River to Lake Ontario. From there, they sailed to Quebec, where they joined up with other British troops under the command of General Frederick Haldimand. Together, they marched south towards Fort Niagara, which was defended by American Colonel William Crawford. Meanwhile, General Sullivan was leading a Patriot force west from Fort Niagara. His goal was to relieve Fort Stanwix, but he was forced to turn back when he heard that the British were approaching. Sullivan then retreated to Fort Schuyler, where he learned that Crawford had been defeated. With his supply lines cut off, Sullivan was forced to abandon his campaign and retreat to Fort Schuyler as well. There, he learned that the British were advancing on the fort and prepared to defend it. But before he could do anything, he was killed in an accident. A stray cannonball landed on a tree near him, causing it to fall and crush him. Lieutenant Colonel John Brooks took command of the fort and successfully defended it against the British. However, he was soon forced to abandon the post when the British captured Fort Frontenac. As the British advanced southward, they were met by Patriot guerrillas, who harassed their supply columns and made life miserable for their troops. Eventually, the British reached Philadelphia, where they set up camp for the winter. As the British were advancing through the wilderness, the French were doing the same thing in the south. Their goal was to capture the city of Savannah, Georgia, which was defended by a force of 2,000 British regulars and 4,000 militia. The French began their advance in December, but were forced to stop when they ran out of supplies. They retreated back to their base at Charleston, South Carolina, where they spent the winter planning their next move. In February, they launched another attack on Savannah, but it failed for the same reason as the last one. The French then decided to try a different tactic. Instead of marching directly on Savannah, they would capture the surrounding countryside and force the British to abandon the city. This worked for a while, but eventually the British counterattacked and drove the French back to their base at Charleston. The French then realized that they could not win a direct confrontation with the British in Georgia, so they shifted their focus to Florida. They captured several Spanish forts in Florida and marched on St. Augustine, which was defended by a force of 2,500 British regulars and 1,500 militia. However, the British were able to hold off the French until reinforcements arrived, at which point the French retreated back to Charleston. While the land battles were raging in North America, the seas were no less contested. The Royal Navy had a strong presence in the Atlantic, but the Americans were able to use their knowledge of the coast to harass British shipping. One of the most famous of these engagements took place off the coast of Cape Hatteras in September of 1779. A squadron of British warships under the command of Commodore Hugh Palliser encountered a group of American privateers. The Americans were led by Captain John Paul Jones, who was in command of the ship Bonhomme Richard. The two squadrons engaged in a fierce battle, but neither side was able to gain the upper hand. Eventually, the British flagship was forced to retreat, but not before being damaged by American fire. This was a small victory for the Americans, but it was one that had a big impact on morale. It showed that even the mighty Royal Navy could be defeated by American ships. Another major engagement took place in the Caribbean in April of 1780. There, a fleet of British warships under the command of Vice Admiral Marriott Arbuthnot encountered a squadron of American frigates under the command of Commodore Thomas Graves. The two fleets engaged in a running battle that lasted for several days, but it was inconclusive. Both sides claimed victory, and in reality, it was a draw. However, the battle had a major impact on trade in the Caribbean. For the next several years, the Royal Navy was unable to protect merchant ships in the area, which resulted in a sharp decline in trade. As the war dragged on, the fighting grew more and more brutal. In North America, the wilderness warfare continued. British General John Burgoyne advanced from Canada into the 13 colonies, but he was defeated by American forces at the Battle of Saratoga in October of 1777. This was a crushing defeat for the British, and it convinced France to enter the war on the side of the Americans. With French assistance, the Americans were able to launch a major offensive in the South in 1780. British General Charles Cornwallis advanced north from Florida, but he was defeated by American forces at the Battle of Camden in August. This was another major blow to the British, and it forced them to abandon their campaign in the South. The fighting then shifted to the western frontier, where British forces under the command of General Anthony Wynne defeated the Americans at the Battle of Fallen Timbers in August of 1794. This ended the major wars between the United States and Native Americans on the frontier. On the seas, the Royal Navy continued to dominate, but the Americans were able to inflict some heavy losses on the British. In 1780, American privateers captured a large number of British merchant ships. In response, the British government passed the Privateering Act, which allowed privateers to plunder American merchant ships. This led to a sharp increase in piracy in the Caribbean and along the coast of North America. The war also saw the introduction of new technologies. The British were the first to use hot air balloons for reconnaissance. The Americans responded by developing the first submarine, which they used to attack British ships. By 1796, the war was essentially over. The Treaty of Paris was signed in September of that year, and it officially ended the war. The United States had won its independence, and it was clear that the country had changed forever. The battles of the Revolutionary War were fought not only on the land and sea, but also in the skies. Early in the war, the British used hot air balloons to observe American troop movements. The Americans responded by developing the first submarine used in combat. But it wasn't just new technology that made the war so unique. The conflict also saw some amazing acts of courage and daring. Perhaps the most famous example of this was the nighttime escape of American troops from British General Cornwallis at Yorktown in October of 1781. Led by Major John Paulding, 9 men escaped from a British prison camp by digging a tunnel under the wall. All 9 men survived, and their daring escape helped to boost American morale during a time when the war was going poorly. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about the Revolutionary War, check out my channel. Thanks for watching. I am so sorry it's taken me so long to get this episode out. It's been very busy over here. But I am excited for this one. We've got 2 very interesting commanders today. Marquis de Montcalm from France and British General James Wolfe, who were both set to die at the Battle of Quebec in 1759. Both men were famous during their lifetimes and are still talked about today. So let's get into it. So like always, I gotta give credit where credit is due. And for those looking to do research on either of these men, I highly recommend The Wolfe Montcalm Legacy by Matthew J.G. Fraser. Not only does it have a fantastically detailed account of the battle itself, but it also has great chapters on each man's life before the battle, as well as their families, legacies, and correspondence, which is incredibly useful for bringing these men to life as people. The first thing that struck me when reading about these men was just how much their personalities and upbringings differed. And yet they had a lot more in common than I originally thought. Montcalm was born Louis Joseph de Montcalm in 1712 to a noble family in what is now part of Belgium. He enjoyed every luxury his family's money could buy, but he wasn't really into the decadent lifestyle that many nobles enjoyed. He wanted something more, something active, something with purpose, and it didn't take him long to find it. James Wolfe was born in 1727 in Britain to a wealthy but impoverished noble family. His father died before he was 2 years old, and his mother raised him and his siblings alone. The family had very little money, and James's mother had to put him and his brother into the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich at age 13. While Montcalm was destined for military glory, at least in his own mind. And Wolfe was thrust into the military. Because his family could not afford for him not to be there, neither man wanted to go to war against each other. In fact, Montcalm was good friends with the British generals he fought against earlier in his career. This would become relevant later. Montcalm joined the army at 16, receiving a commission as a second lieutenant in a regiment stationed in Canada, and by age 23, he was promoted to the rank of captain. But with no battles to fight, Montcalm decided to return to France and began working his way up the social ladder through parties and events. By networking and being a generally handsome guy with a bit of charm, he was able to get himself noticed by some important people and get himself a cushy job back in Canada as an engineer, which he did quite well. He distinguished himself by building fortifications and helped to repel an attack by the British on Louisbourg in 1745. The same year he was promoted to the rank of major. This victory brought him fame and glory in France. When his superiors asked for him to be sent somewhere else, the king himself said, "No, I want him here." Then in 1746, he was promoted to lieutenant colonel, but even though he was doing well for himself, he still desired more challenges. And when war broke out again with the British in 1756, he asked for a command. Meanwhile, Wolfe had been promoted multiple times throughout the 1740s, thanks largely to his mother pulling strings. In 1747, he became captain of a company in his regiment. In 1748, he got a major's commission. And in 1751, he became a lieutenant colonel. But unlike Montcalm, Wolfe had seen real fighting. During the war between Britain and France in the 1740s, Wolfe saw action in the Low Countries, and in 1751, he was seriously wounded during the Battle of La Houlissier. Despite being wounded, Wolfe continued to fight until his men retreated, and then he had to be carried off the battlefield. This battle proved to be a turning point in his career. According to Fraser, in hindsight, the wounds he received at Lisieux marked not only the physical and psychological limits of his endurance, but also the upper limits of his military career. From then on, he started to really excel at his job. He trained hard, studied tactics, and learned languages. Namely French, which will become very important later. By 1756, when the 7 Years' War began, he was a major general at 29 years old and was given command of a force to capture the French fortress of Louisbourg. While the siege was going on, his health took a turn for the worse. He fell violently ill with what we would call malaria and was sent back to Britain to recover. When Montcalm heard about the siege of Louisbourg, he wrote to a friend, "It is impossible to say anything bad of Wolfe. He is brave and a capable engineer. However, if fortune permits, I will give you a different opinion of him." After Montcalm took over the defenses of Canada in 1756, he knew that the British were coming. They had already attacked once, and he expected them to come back. In 1759, while staying at his friend's estate in New France, he wrote to his friend's wife, "We are on the point of seeing the enemy. I expect him every moment, and I know he is preparing to attack us with all his force. My dear madame, please do not be alarmed at the sound of cannons, which may be heard every day, for this can only be the result of a 10, a 20, or a 50-gun salute. You will see the enemy retreat." Despite the confidence he showed his friend's wife, Montcalm was secretly worried about the coming battle. In a letter to his sister, he writes, "As soon as the English are within range, we shall begin a most tremendous but do not imagine that cannon balls can be resisted by means of palisades. What is wanted is a good ditch and a deep one. You must not suppose that I am afraid of the English. No, no. I despise them. I should be more so if the Canadians were not with us. For my own part, I care nothing about the danger. I have exposed my life often enough. I know that death comes only when God wills it, and this is all that one can say when one stands in the face of such an attack. I fear less for myself than for the colony, which I believe will be ruined unless Providence has decreed otherwise." Now, despite his fears for his colony and his people, he was a brave soldier and strategist, and would go on to defend Quebec bravely against the British, delaying them long enough to have his men ready and prepared to meet them in open battle, which would come a few weeks later. Wolfe, on the other hand, had been in the military his whole life, and while he might not have wanted to go to war against the French, he certainly wasn't afraid of dying in battle. He was actually the complete opposite. In fact, after recovering from his illness, he basically threw himself into his work, studying and training nonstop. Until he was given command of the expedition to Quebec, he was determined to succeed because he desperately wanted to prove himself and earned his place in history. Now, while he was brave and headstrong, he was also hot-headed and arrogant, which got him into trouble on occasion. Like in 1757, when he was given control of the British garrison at Cape Breton Island, he boasted that he would hold out against the entire French army. Of course, he didn't, and his arrogance got him suspended from duty for a time. But, in the end, he was reinstated and given command of the invasion of New France in 1759. Everything seemed to be going well for him. He defeated Montcalm at the Battle of the Ristigouche in 1759 and began his march on Quebec. What surprised me the most about these men was that they were both incredibly human. Neither one was perfect. They both doubted themselves and their abilities. They both made mistakes and suffered the consequences. They both wrote emotional letters to their loved ones, and both had things they needed to prove to themselves. Sure, Montcalm was cocky and arrogant at times, and Wolfe was hot-headed and impulsive, but they were also brave and intelligent, and cared deeply for their men and their respective countries. Now, of course, we remember them today mostly for the Battle of Quebec, but I think their lives and careers were a lot more than just that battle. And thank you so much for watching. Chapter 10. Turning of the Tide, 1757 to 1759. The year 1757 began with a sense of unease on both sides of the Atlantic. For 3 years, Britain and her American colonies had suffered humiliation and loss. Fort after fort had fallen to the French, and British commanders seemed unable to master the tangled forests and swift rivers of North America. In London, newspapers lamented a war that seemed to consume money and lives with little to show in return. Yet beneath this gloom, a quiet shift was taking place, one that would transform the conflict and, in time, the world. A new leader, as the man at the center of this shift, was William Pitt the Elder. Appointed Secretary of State, Pitt brought a fierce energy to Britain's war effort. He believed that the future of the British Empire rested not just on the fields of Europe, but on the distant frontiers of America, the Caribbean, and India. Pitt resolved to pour resources into the colony's troops, ships, and money on a scale never before attempted. He also showed a rare willingness to respect the colonial assemblies, offering to reimburse them for their contributions. This gesture soothed tensions that had flared between imperial officers and local militias. The fortress at Louisbourg. Pitt's new strategy was soon put to the test. In 1758, he ordered a massive expedition to capture Louisbourg, a French fortress guarding the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. Louisbourg was no ordinary outpost. It was a gateway to the heart of New France, the river corridor that linked Quebec and Montreal to the Atlantic world. The assault force was immense. More than 27,000 men and over 150 ships assembled off Cape Breton Island, a sight that must have seemed overwhelming even to seasoned soldiers. The siege was slow and methodical. British guns battered Louisbourg's walls, while sailors and marines cut off French supply lines. The defenders, brave but outnumbered, endured weeks of bombardment before finally lowering their flag. The fall of Louisbourg sent shockwaves through France, and a surge of relief through the British colonies. For the first time in years, the colonists felt that victory might be possible. Fort Frontenac and the West's success bred momentum. In August 1758, British forces under Lieutenant Colonel John Bradstreet advanced on Fort Frontenac, a key French supply post on Lake Ontario. The fort's capture severed French communication lines to the western Great Lakes and the Ohio Valley. It also convinced many native nations that the balance of power was shifting. Alliances that had long favored the French began to waver. For indigenous leaders, survival depended on choosing the partner most likely to endure. Fort Duquesne abandoned further south. General John Forbes led a patient campaign against Fort Duquesne. Learning from Braddock's disaster in 1755, Forbes built roads and forts as he advanced, ensuring secure supply lines. Facing this relentless approach, the French abandoned and destroyed Fort Duquesne in late 1758. In its place, the British raised a new Fort Pitt, what is now Pittsburgh. The Ohio Valley, once fiercely contested, now tilted toward British control. Montcalm holds Quebec, yet the French were not beaten. The Marquis de Montcalm, commanding in Canada, was a skilled strategist and an inspiring leader. His victories at Fort Oswego and Fort William Henry had shown his ability to outwit and outmaneuver larger forces. In 1759, as British armies pressed closer, Montcalm prepared Quebec's defenses. The city, perched high above the St. Lawrence on its commanding cliffs, seemed nearly impregnable. The approach of Wolfe, the man chosen to challenge Montcalm, was Major General James Wolfe, a young officer whose daring spirit had already impressed Pitt. Wolfe was only 32 years old, and though plagued by ill health, he possessed a restless energy that matched Pitt's own determination. Leading a fleet up the St. Lawrence River, Wolfe faced daunting obstacles. Strong French positions, rugged terrain, and the ever-present threat of winter's arrival. Throughout the summer of 1759, Wolfe attempted to draw Montcalm out from the city's walls. Raids along the countryside aimed to disrupt supplies and force a confrontation, but Montcalm remained cautious. The stalemate wore on, with disease spreading among the British troops and morale fraying. A bold gamble the plains of Abraham then. On a cool September night, Wolfe made a bold decision. Guided by local knowledge and aided by the tides, his men scaled the cliffs west of Quebec under cover of darkness. By dawn, on September 13, 1759, a British army of about 4,500 men stood on the plains of Abraham, a flat expanse just outside Quebec's walls. Montcalm, surprised but undaunted, gathered his forces for battle. The clash was brief but decisive. British lines held firm under the French advance, then counterattacked with deadly volleys. Within minutes, the French were in retreat. Both commanders, however, paid the ultimate price. Wolfe was struck by musket fire and died on the field, learning with his last breath that victory was his. Montcalm, mortally wounded, was carried into Quebec, where he passed away the next morning. The deaths of these two men opponents, yet bound by fate, became legendary, symbols of courage and sacrifice. Quebec falls, the fall of Quebec, stunned the French world. Though the city's defenders would later attempt a counterattack during the spring thaw, the British grip on the St. Lawrence could not be broken. By 1760, Montreal would surrender, effectively ending major French resistance in North America. The global context, while battles raged in the Canadian wilderness, the war's outcome was also shaped by events across the globe. In the Caribbean, British forces captured Guadeloupe, a sugar-rich island whose value rivaled entire continental territories. In Europe, Britain's ally Prussia strained French resources, preventing reinforcements from reaching Canada. Pitt's vision of a truly global conflict had paid off. By stretching France thin, Britain gained the upper hand on every front, the emotional turning point for the British colonists. These victories carried emotional weight. After years of fear of frontier raids, of burning farms, of forts falling in the night, the news of Quebec's fall brought relief and celebration. Bonfires lit towns from Boston to Charleston. Ministers preached sermons of thanksgiving, yet beneath the joy lay a subtle shift in colonial attitudes. The war had shown them that British power. Tug-McTee had faltered before. Colonial militias had fought bravely beside regular troops. Some began to wonder, if they could help win a global war, might they also claim a greater voice in their own affairs? Reflections under the stars imagined the forests of New France after the armies had marched on. The first frost, creeping over the St. Lawrence Valley. Canoes gliding silently across dark waters once contested so bitterly. For native nations, the British triumph brought uncertainty. Old alliances were gone. Promises made by French officers, now broken. For the French settlers who remained, a new flag would fly, and their way of life would adapt or fade. For Britain, the war's turning point meant the creation of a vast empire, one that stretched from the Caribbean to Canada, from India to Africa. But it also meant debt, taxes, and the strain of governing distant lands. The tide had turned, but the future still held storms. A soft, closing note. As you drift toward sleep, picture the quiet fields outside Quebec, where grass now grows over the scars of musket balls and cannon fire. The river flows steadily past, carrying with it memories of empires and ambitions. Wolfe and Montcalm, two men who would never see their homelands again, rest in history's embrace. The world they fought to shape had changed forever. And so, the French and Indian War moved toward its conclusion. The course of continents altered beneath the northern lights. Well, hey there, welcome back to my channel. And here we are in chapter 11, where we going to see how the 7 Years' War wound down. So if you're ready to finish up this war, then let's get to it. Okay, so where did we leave off? Ah yes, with the British taking control of the Ohio Valley country, which was an important victory for them. But they still had some unfinished business in Canada. Now, Britain had made 2 attempts to capture the city of Montreal, but both times the French had been able to repel their attacks. But now, in 1760, Britain would have another opportunity because a new British general named James Abercrombie was determined to take Montreal once and for all. Now, Abercrombie's plan was to send one group of troops through the lakes to the west of Montreal, and then another group would come from the south to sandwich the city and cut off any possible escape routes. However, these plans fell apart right away, because the troops that were sent west actually ended up coming across a much larger force of British troops who had captured Fort Niagara and who were also headed toward Montreal. They informed the troops of what was going on, and together they came up with a new plan. The plan was to construct 3 forts around Montreal, one north of the city near the river, another just southeast of the city, and then the third one here on the south shore of the St. Lawrence River. And then with those 3 forts constructed, they could hopefully lay siege to the city itself. So the British began construction on Fort Montgomery at the northern end. They also built Fort Little in the center, but the British forces at Fort Little were quickly driven out by the French. So now, the British only had 2 forts. And while the British were building their forts, the French commander in Montreal, Pierre de Rigaud de Vaudreuil, decided to make one last attempt to relieve the pressure on his troops. He would lead a force of about 3,000 men south to attack the British supply depot at Quebec. If he could destroy the supplies there, then the British wouldn't be able to sustain their siege. However, when Vaudreuil got to Quebec, he found out that the British had already evacuated the city. So instead of attacking the empty city, he decided to attack the British forces at Fort Montgomery. His plan was to drive the British back to the river and then take the fort. But it didn't work out, like he hoped. The British were able to hold off the French long enough until more British troops arrived. And then they were able to defeat the French and push them back to Montreal. So now, with the French unable to relieve Montreal, all that was left to do was to lay siege to the city. On August 27, 1760, the British bombarded the city, and after only 8 days of fighting, the French surrendered. With the fall of Montreal, New France was effectively over. All that remained was the formal end to the war. And so representatives from Britain, France, and Spain met together in Paris in 1763 to sign the Treaty of Paris, which officially ended the war. Now, according to the treaty, France had to cede all of her territories east of the Mississippi River to Britain. This included not just Canada, but also the important port of Newfoundland and the island of Cape Breton. Additionally, France gave up the Ohio Valley country to Britain as well. So basically, all of this land, the entire Mississippi Valley region, went to Britain. In exchange for this land, France received the islands of Guadeloupe, Dominica, and Marie-Galante from the British, and they also gained control of Louisiana from Spain. You see, while France was giving up all of her territory east of the Mississippi, Spain was doing just the opposite. She was gaining all of the French territories west of the Mississippi, plus even some extra ones on the East Coast. How does that work? Well, remember, Spain had been fighting against the British for quite some time, too, and so they wanted something out of this deal as well. So let me go ahead and explain how the land transfer went. Here we have the North American continent, and right here is France. And as you can see, she's losing all of her land east of the Mississippi River. So all of this land goes to Britain. Then here is Spain, and she's actually gaining land, not just the French territories west of the Mississippi, but also a bit of Florida from Britain, and then also the Bahamas as well. So Spain got pretty lucky in this deal. In fact, she probably did better than anyone else. So let's go ahead and take a look at the rest of the world. As we move over here to Europe, we can see that Prussia, who was allied with Britain, gained a bit of land in the Holy Roman Empire. Then we have Austria, who was allied with France, and she didn't gain any land. But at least the war ended without her losing any land either. Then here is Portugal, who had been allied with Britain since 1750. And they gained some African territory. And finally, Britain got nothing out of this deal except for some Caribbean islands. Now, that might seem kinda disappointing, but remember, Britain had captured so much territory during the war that she didn't really need anything else. In fact, the only reason why they fought the war was to keep from splitting up their North American colonies, and they accomplished that. Now, speaking of Britain's North American colonies, after the war, they began to grow very quickly, because Britain now had more immigrants coming to the colonies. And the reason why is because Britain had gone through a very violent shift in population during the war. See, when the war broke out between Britain and France in 1756, there was a massive amount of people living in Britain who had been born in the American colonies. Many of these people were loyalists, who still had family and friends in the colonies. And so when the war broke out, many of them wanted to go back to the colonies to help out the British effort, and Britain allowed them to do so. So over the course of the war, hundreds of thousands of British citizens traveled to the colonies to fight the French. But then, as the war drew to a close and peace negotiations began, many of these people started to worry about what was going to happen to them. Would they be forced to return to Britain? For many of them, that wasn't an option because they had left behind wives or children in the colonies. And so for these people, the thought of returning to Britain meant leaving behind everything that they had ever known. So with no clear answer, many people just stayed in the colonies rather than risk being forced back to Britain. And so, after the war, Britain had to figure out what to do with all of these people. But in the meantime, the colonial governors simply allowed them to stay and become part of their colonial society. In addition to that, you had many Native Americans who also moved to the colonies. Remember, prior to the war, the Iroquois Confederacy had been allied with the British, and the French had been allied with most of the other tribes. But after the war, the Iroquois stayed loyal to the British, so they moved into the colonies. And then there were also many others who had been loyal to the French who fled to Canada after the war. So basically, After the 7 Years' War, there was a huge influx of population in Britain's North American colonies, and so now these colonies would begin to grow very rapidly. The population in the colonies nearly doubled in the next 2 decades, and that caused all sorts of changes in the social, economic, and political makeup of the colonies. And for more on that, you can check out my video on the American Revolution right here. Okay, so that brings us to the end of chapter 11. And here we see the end of the 7 Years' War and the beginning of a whole new era of world history. Now, if you want to continue on to chapter 12, then click right here. Or if you want to review chapter 10, then click right here. And if this video helped you out, then feel free to give me a thumbs up or leave me a comment. Thanks. Bye. Okay, it's time to talk about chapter 12, the price of victory. And if you want me to keep talking about the past in this fun way, then you can help out by subscribing and doing all those other things. Those things really do help, so thanks so much for doing those things. Alright, let's get to chapter 12. So at the end of chapter 11, we left off with the British victory at Quebec and the capture of Montreal, and thus the end of the French and Indian War. But there's a big problem. Britain now owed a whole bunch of money. I mean, they spent over 100 million pounds on this war, and to put that in perspective, the entire British Empire only made around 80 million pounds annually. So they're in debt, and they need to find some extra money and fast. They also, as we talked about, had just acquired a whole bunch of land from the French, including all of the land that we today call Canada and a huge chunk of what is the modern United States. And so they needed to figure out what to do with all of that land. But first, let's go ahead and meet our good friend, George. George is an average colonist, but he's got a problem because in the midst of celebrating the British victory, he's feeling a little bit conflicted. See, on the one hand, he's proud to be British. He loves British culture. He likes the king. He believes in the British Empire. But on the other hand, those French were his neighbors, and many of them were his friends, and he doesn't want them to be wiped out or sent back to France. Also, many colonists feel like they have a right to the land that the French just lost, especially because they had lived alongside it for decades. In fact, some of them had even explored west of this region during the war. For instance, George Rogers. Clark led a group of Virginia militia on an expedition into the Illinois country and successfully captured the British fort at Cass. He then went on to lead troops in capturing more than 40 British forts. So many colonists were getting the itch to move west. Which brings us to the first seed of tension between Britain and its colonies. The Proclamation Line of 1763. This line was a boundary set at the Appalachian Mountains that forbade colonists from moving west of it. This wasn't really a law that the colonists themselves voted on and passed. It was the British government imposing something on the colonies, and while most of the colonists understood the British perspective, many of them didn't like it. After all, they had fought hard to defeat the French and take this land, so why not let the people who helped take the land get to claim some of it? Well, for one, the British wanted to avoid another conflict with the natives, who still lived on that land. In fact, that was part of the reason they drew the line at the Appalachians, rather than the Mississippi River. There was just too much Native American territory in between. And believe me, after fighting a long and costly war against the French and their Native American allies, the last thing the British wanted to do was start a war with the natives. Not to mention, the British couldn't afford to pay for another war. Remember, they were in debt. However, this proclamation line did not apply to land that had already been granted to colonies before 1763. So if you were, say, Virginia, you could continue to claim all of that land west of the Appalachians that you had claimed before 1763, as well as any land that you bought from an Indian tribe. In fact, the British government actually encouraged this, because they figured it would be easier to manage a few large colonies than a bunch of small ones. So that's exactly what the royal governor of Virginia, John Murray, 4th Earl of Dunmore, did. In 1763, he purchased an enormous amount of land from the Iroquois Confederacy, all of it west of the Appalachian Mountains. But there was a problem. One of the leaders of the Iroquois Confederacy was kind of hot-headed, and he was unhappy about the deal. His name was Joseph Brant, and he immediately began to agitate other Iroquois as well as other Native Americans in the area, encouraging them to fight back against the colonists who were encroaching on their lands. And this group was going to be known as the Shawnees, after the Shawnee leader, who along with Joseph Brant, formed a confederacy with the Cherokee, the Choctaw, and the Creeks. Their goal was to stop the colonists from taking their land, and so they waged a brutal war against the colonists. Now, to be fair to the British, when they made the proclamation line, they thought that the natives weren't organized enough to mount a serious challenge to the colonists. But they were wrong. As the years went on, the British discovered that these various tribes were uniting together and creating a formidable force, and so they asked the colonists to move the proclamation line further west. But the colonists refused. They argued that since they had paid for this land with their lives, they should be able to move wherever they wanted. This created a lot of tension between the colonies and Britain. But it wasn't the only thing that did. There were also tensions over the issue of taxation. See, the British were still in debt from the French and Indian War, and they desperately needed to get that money back. And so they started taxing the colonies, which, to put it mildly, the colonists were not fans of. The first tax that they imposed was the Sugar Act of 1764. It placed taxes on sugar and molasses that would be used to make rum. And while these were things that the colonists used a lot, they were not happy about paying a tax on them. Then in 1765, they passed the Stamp Act, which taxed all kinds of printed materials: newspapers, pamphlets, legal documents, playing cards, you name it. And while this tax was unpopular, it was really just the beginning. Over the next few years, the British government would pass a number of acts that taxed the colonists. Some of them were very popular, like the Townshend Acts, which taxed things like glass, tea, paper, and paint. These were things that the colonists used a lot, and so they weren't too keen on paying taxes on them either. But none of these taxes were as unpopular as the Tea Act of 1773, which put a tax on tea. Now, the colonists didn't mind paying a tax on tea, per se. They just didn't like that the British East India Company, which had a monopoly on tea sales, was given a tax break that other merchants did not receive. And so they organized a protest against the tax, which came to be known as the Boston Tea Party. On December 16, 1773, members of the Sons of Liberty snuck onto merchant ships, docked in the Boston harbor, and dumped 92,000 pounds of tea into the water. Now, Britain was not pleased about this, and they responded with what became known as the Intolerable Acts. These were 4 acts passed by Parliament in 1774. The first closed the port of Boston until the merchants of Boston paid for the tea that had been destroyed. The second was the Massachusetts Government Act, which basically established martial law in Massachusetts. The third was the Administration of Justice Act, which stated the British officials involved in the enforcement of laws in Massachusetts would not have to stand trial in Massachusetts. And finally, the fourth act was the Quartering Act, which allowed British soldiers to be housed in private homes in Massachusetts. Needless to say, the colonists were not happy about any of this, and so a group of them met up at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in September of 1774. There they wrote a list of grievances against the British government and demanded that they be repealed, but the king refused and instead sent in troops to arrest the leaders of the Congress. And so the time had come for the colonies to decide whether they were gonna be a part of Britain or not. Okay, click here to keep reviewing for Unit 3, and I'll see you in the next video. In our last video, we discussed the end of the French and Indian War and how the 7 Years' War ended in North America. And now it's time for Chapter 13, Native Resistance and Pontiac's Rebellion. And if you want more information, check out the information below or after the video. But first, let's get to the video. By the end of the French and Indian War, most native nations in the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region were bitterly disappointed in the results. While the war had been fought in large part over land rights and claims, the victorious British showed little interest in honoring any of the treaties they had made with the tribes during the war. The various tribes had sided with the British in hopes that their ally would respect their land claims and would curb the expansion of colonial settlements into tribal territories. But once the war was over, British policymakers showed no such inclination. Instead, they redoubled their efforts to open up Indian lands for settlement and resource extraction by colonists. As a result, several tribes took up arms against the British in what would become known as Pontiac's Rebellion. Pontiac's Rebellion was a direct outgrowth of the war that had just ended. The conflict began in 1763, only months after the official conclusion of the larger war, and it was led by a man named Ottawa Chief Pontiac. In order to understand who Pontiac was, we have to go back a few years earlier to the middle of the French and Indian War. During the war, the French and the various tribes allied with them launched a series of attacks into the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region, targeting British colonial settlements and supply depots. One of the most successful of these attacks occurred in 1758 when a coalition of Ottawa, Mississauga, Wyandot, and other tribes attacked Fort Detroit, which was held by the British. The fort was defended by a force of about 300 British regulars and 2,000 colonial militia under the command of Captain Robert Rogers. The siege lasted nearly 2 months and resulted in the deaths of about 100 British soldiers and militia, while an unknown number of Native Americans also perished in the conflict. However, due to the arrival of British reinforcements, the Native American coalition was eventually forced to lift the siege and retreat. During the course of the battle, one of the Native American leaders caught the eye of his British opponents. This was the Ottawa chief, named Ottawas, or more commonly, Pontiac. Despite being a fierce warrior and military leader, he was well liked by his British opponents and even became friends with Captain Robert Rogers. In fact, Rogers' journal contains numerous references to his friendship with Pontiac, describing him as a man of courage, honor, and great dignity. This relationship between the two men would become a key factor in the post-war conflict. After the war, Pontiac continued to advocate for peace between the tribes and the British, believing that through diplomacy and accommodation, the two sides could coexist peacefully. However, his fellow tribal leaders were not so trusting of the British. They pointed to the long history of broken treaties and broken promises between the tribes and the European powers as evidence that peace would simply not be possible. Ultimately, though, Pontiac's views would prevail and a peace treaty was signed between the tribes and the British in 1763. However, this peace was short-lived. The following year, Pontiac and some of his warriors attacked several British forts in the Great Lakes region. The attacks were a response to British policies designed to force the tribes off their lands in the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region and move them further west. In particular, the tribes were outraged by the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which forbade settlement past the Appalachian Mountains. But perhaps more important than any single policy was the failure of the British to live up to their end of the bargain in the peace treaty they had signed with the tribes the previous year. As I mentioned before, when the war ended, the tribes believed that the British would honor the various treaties they had made with the tribes during the course of the war. However, despite the existence of these treaties, British policymakers sought to open up tribal lands for colonial settlement and resource extraction. To achieve this goal, they passed a series of acts designed to accomplish that goal. In addition to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, there was the Quebec Act of 1763, which extended the boundaries of the province of Quebec to the Ohio River, much to the anger of the tribes and the American colonists. Then there was the Land Claims Ordinance of 1763, which provided for the orderly surveying and distribution of native lands to colonial settlers. And finally, there was the Indian Act of 1763, which established a system for the legal removal of natives from their lands. In response to these policies, Pontiac and a number of other tribal leaders began planning a rebellion. Although the specifics of the plan are not known, it is believed that Pontiac and his allies hoped to drive the British from the Ohio Valley and the Great Lakes region, and establish an independent state free from European interference. At the outbreak of hostilities in May 1763, Pontiac's forces consisted of several hundred warriors from the Ottawa, Mississauga, Wyandot, Delaware, and Shawnee tribes. Over the next few months, however, his forces would grow to include thousands of warriors from dozens of different tribes. The war began with a series of ambushes and raids on British forts and trading posts. In June, for example, a group of 2,000 Native Americans attacked and destroyed a British garrison at Fort Louisbourg in present-day Pennsylvania. Similarly, in July, a force of 500 Native Americans attacked and defeated a British detachment at Fort St. Joseph in present-day Michigan. These initial attacks were designed to weaken the British and force them to the negotiating table. However, the British were unwilling to do either. Instead, they responded to the attacks with a series of punitive expeditions into native territories. In August 1763, for example, British forces led by Lieutenant Colonel Henry Bouquet marched into the Ohio Valley and defeated a large native force at the Battle of the Wabash. The following year, British forces led by Major James Rogers conducted a brutal campaign against the natives in Michigan, burning their villages and killing or capturing their warriors. Despite these setbacks, Pontiac's forces continued to resist the British. In fact, the rebellion reached its climax in June 1764 when Pontiac and his allies laid siege to Fort Detroit. At the time, the fort was defended by a force of about 350 British regulars and 1,000 militia under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Henry Hamilton. The siege lasted for 59 days and resulted in the deaths of about 200 British soldiers and militia, while an unknown number of Native Americans also perished in the conflict. However, due to the arrival of British reinforcements, Pontiac and his allies were eventually forced to lift the siege and retreat. Ultimately, Pontiac's rebellion would come to an end in 1766 with the signing of the Treaty of Fort Frontenac. At the time, the British were able to offer the natives only a portion of what they had originally been promised, but the terms of the treaty were acceptable to most tribes. Although the rebellion had ultimately failed, it did succeed in forcing the British to reconsider their frontier policies. In particular, the British realized that they could not rely solely on military force to subdue the natives. Instead, they would have to adopt a more conciliatory approach to dealing with the tribes. As a result, the British government implemented a number of reforms designed to improve relations with the natives. In 1767, for example, the British government replaced the colonial governors, who had been most responsible for the conflict, with more moderate leaders. Additionally, the British government created the position of Superintendent of Indian Affairs and appointed William Johnson to the role. Finally, the British government also began to enforce the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which forbade settlement past the Appalachian Mountains. Now, whether or not these reforms would have eventually paid off is something we may never know, but unfortunately, Britain wouldn't be around long enough to find out. Just a few years later, the American Revolution broke out, and the vast majority of Native American tribes sided with the British during the war. And as we discussed in my video on the American Revolution, they would be largely unsuccessful. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please hit the like button. If you want more information, check out the information below or after the video. And as always, thanks for watching. Alright, it's time to talk about Chapter 14, which is all about colonial unrest and the road to revolution. And if that doesn't sound exciting, then I don't know what does. Anyway, let's get to it. Okay, so this chapter begins by reminding us of the connection between post-war taxes like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act, and the colonial protests we saw at the end of Chapter 13. Now, it is important to remember that these acts were passed in the context of Britain trying to pay off the massive debt they incurred during the 7 Years' War. And when Parliament passes these acts, they are met with colonial resistance, protests, and even boycotts. And that's a big deal, because up until this point, colonists have been pretty much loyal subjects of the British Crown. But now we're starting to see cracks in that loyalty. And by the end of the chapter, there will be no more loyalty. So, in this context of increasing tensions, the chapter wants us to consider how we got from the Sugar Act to full-blown revolution. And the answer lies in the way that British officials failed to understand the colonies and the colonists. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But first, let's begin with a review. Okay, so what do you already know about this topic? Well, hopefully a lot, since this is the culmination of everything we've been studying. So let's try to pull it all together. In the end of Chapter 13, we saw a growing colonial discontent over things like the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. And then we ended the chapter with the Boston Massacre, which was an incident in which British soldiers fired upon and killed several American civilians. And as a result of this massacre, colonial leaders began to really frame this conflict as one between liberty and tyranny. And that's important because this is the mindset that will lead to revolution. Also in Chapter 13, we saw the beginning of the idea of a colonial identity forming, because before this, most colonists thought of themselves as British, but now they are starting to think of themselves differently. And that's because colonial leaders are mobilizing people to resist British rule. And they're doing that through things like boycotts and acts of civil disobedience. And that's important too, because these are peaceful ways of resisting British rule. But they're also building a sense of community and solidarity among the colonists. Because in order for these things to work, you need people from all the different colonies to participate. So in order to get the most out of the boycott, for example, people have to put aside their provincial differences and work together. And in doing so, They're creating a sense of unity among the colonies that has never existed before. And that sense of unity will only grow as the chapter progresses. Okay, so now let's go back to those British officials who don't understand the colonies. And you can really see this lack of understanding after the Boston Massacre, because the British officials tried to use force to put down colonial resistance instead of addressing their grievances, and that only inflamed the situation. Then the Tea Act happened, and the British thought that would solve the problem, because it gave the British East India Company a monopoly on tea sales in the colonies. But that just resulted in more protests, like the Boston Tea Party. And the British response was to pass the Coercive Acts, also known as the Intolerable Acts, which were meant to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. And again, this was not an effective strategy, because it only unified the colonies in opposition to British rule. And so, here's the thing. British officials consistently misread the situation in the colonies, because they viewed the colonists primarily as obedient subjects who just needed to be reminded of their place. And that's why they kept sending in troops and passing more restrictive acts. But they failed to realize that the colonists were becoming increasingly alienated from British rule, and that any attempt to use force against them would only result in more resistance. They didn't understand that the colonists weren't just subjects, but rather people with rights and grievances who deserve to be heard. And that's the argument that colonial leaders are making in their writings, like the Suffolk Resolves, which argue that the colonists have the right to resist oppressive rule. And the idea that the colonists have rights is revolutionary, because it challenges the divine right of kings. And if you want a quick review on that, check out the video on the English channel. But this idea that the king has a divine right to rule is exactly what the colonists are challenging here. And what's interesting is that they are using Enlightenment ideas to make their case. And if you need a review on Enlightenment ideas, then check out the video on the French channel. But colonial leaders like John Hancock and Samuel Adams are using Enlightenment ideals to argue for colonial rights. And they reframing this conflict as one between liberty and tyranny. And this is the mentality that will eventually lead to war. And that brings us to the last part of the chapter, which talks about the First Continental Congress. Now, this was a meeting of colonial delegates in Philadelphia in 1774, where they organized a response to British policies and created a unified colonial government. And this was significant because it was the first time that representatives from all the colonies met together to discuss a common set of grievances. And it also helped to further solidify the idea of a colonial identity. But it is also significant because this is when the colonies first started to consider the possibility of independence. And we can see this in the Declaration and Resolves, which outlined the colonial grievances against the British, and it also asserted the right of the colonies to self-government. And although the Congress stopped short of declaring independence, it did open the door to that possibility. And that is because these delegates recognized that reconciliation with Britain seemed impossible at this point, and that led to the outbreak of the American Revolution. Okay, so now let's finish with a quick review. We began by considering how we got from the Sugar Act to revolution, and the answer was largely due to British officials failing to understand the colonies and the colonists. And as a result, they used force and oppression instead of addressing colonial grievances. Then we looked at the main events of the chapter, including the Boston Massacre, the Tea Act, the Coercive Acts, and the First Continental Congress. And throughout all of this, we saw growing colonial unrest and a growing sense of colonial identity. And ultimately, we saw the door open to independence because the colonists realized that reconciliation with Britain seemed impossible. Okay, that's what I've got for you. If you want even more help getting an A in your class and a 5 on your exam in May, then click right over here in the review packet and all your dreams will come true. And finally, if this video helped you and you want me to keep making them, then by all means subscribe and I shall oblige. Anyway, I'm out. Alright, so we've just finished an entire war, so let's take a moment to reflect on what happened. Welcome to my channel, and in this video, we are going to do something a little different. We're not going to talk about battles, or military strategy, or even really politics. Instead, in this video, we are simply going to reflect on what it was like for the people of North America during the French and Indian War. How did this conflict change them? How did it change their relationship with Britain? And what does all of this have to do with the coming American Revolution? So grab a mug of your favorite beverage, Get yourself comfortable and let's reflect on the French and Indian War together. In a way, this whole war started because of a single skirmish. In 1754, a young Virginian named George Washington got into a fight with a French lieutenant named Joseph de Montcalm over territorial claims in western Pennsylvania. Washington lost that battle, but eventually the British would win the war. As a result, France no longer had any territory east of the Mississippi River. They also lost tens of thousands of men during the conflict. Their North American population plummeted from around 2 million to just 60,000 by the end of the war. And the British had captured Canada, which would never again attempt to be independent from Britain. So now let's take a moment to consider how this war impacted those who lived here. First off, there were two distinct sides fighting this war in North America. There was the British side, which consisted of the colonies, but also some Native American tribes. And then there was the French side, which had its own mix of European colonial troops and Native Americans. At times, the war was very brutal. The Iroquois people are a good example. They aligned themselves with the British because they wanted to expand their landholdings into the Ohio Valley. But as the war dragged on, the Iroquois began to suffer from attacks from other tribes who were allied with the French. It was bad enough that the Iroquois leader, Sir William Johnson, wrote to the British pleading for more protection. "We find ourselves obliged to kill or be killed," he wrote. "Our warriors Kuyen travel into the interior parts of the country to hunt, and Kuyen go into our fields to gather our grain. Our women and children can't go into the woods to gather corn and other necessaries, despite being allies." The Iroquois and the British couldn't always see eye to eye, though when peace came, the Iroquois wanted to continue fighting the French, but British commanders wanted to end hostilities and establish good relations with the Iroquois. This wasn't the only time during the war that these two allied groups had friction. During the siege of Fort Pitt, for instance, Iroquois men allied with the British trapped hundreds of Native Americans inside the fort. Many of them starved to death. And when survivors surrendered the fort, they were horrified at what they saw. According to one eyewitness, the British, being entirely out of provisions, had recourse to the most horrible expedient to prevent starvation: cannibalism. The war was also devastating for the vast majority of Native Americans who didn't make it to the end. For example, the powerful Huron tribe went from 20,000 to just 300 survivors by the end of the conflict. And this isn't just because they died in battle. Things like disease and famine took a huge toll on Native American populations. The most famous example is probably Pontiac, the Ottawa chief who led a major Native American uprising against the British in 1763. Pontiac's forces nearly overran every British post west of the Appalachian Mountains, but the British commander, Colonel Henry Bouquet, hunted him down and killed him in a battle near present-day Chicago. His death pretty much ended the rebellion. It was also a devastating war for the Europeans, especially the French. Early in the war, a force of British regulars and colonial militia set out from Fort Shirley to capture Fort Niagara. They failed to do so, but they did manage to capture 3 French soldiers. In the ensuing battle, one of those prisoners, Louis Capitaine, shot the man who would become the first American to die in the Revolutionary War. Another prisoner, Jean Lemon, was taken back to Boston where he was paraded through the streets and hanged in front of a crowd. He was just 19 years old. It was a tough war for the British as well, actually. They also suffered terrible losses from disease and famine, just like the Native Americans, and they often underestimated their foes. The British commander-in-chief, the Earl of Loudoun, summed up his thoughts on the difficulties of fighting the French and Native Americans in North America. "I am convinced that nothing will decide this campaign, but a strong and able, well-disciplined army officer by men of real merit, steady and well-principled." So what did this war accomplish? Well, for the British, it meant that they now controlled all of North America east of the Mississippi River. And thanks to the treaty, they also gained the valuable territory of Canada. Unfortunately for the British, they also inherited a bunch of problems along with all of that territory. And the biggest headache was the fact that they now controlled a bunch of land west of the Appalachian Mountains. Ever since the end of the 7 Years' War, the British government had been trying to figure out what to do with this territory. Should they try to populate it? Should they just leave it alone? It was hard to know what to do. As far as the colonists were concerned, however, the answer was obvious. The vast majority of them wanted to move west. Even before the war was over, people were already pouring into this region. By 1763, around 1,000 colonists, moved west of the Appalachians each year. But the British weren't ready for this, and they didn't want to deal with the legal ramifications of so many settlers claiming land that was legally theirs. So they passed a law called the Proclamation of 1763, which forbade anyone from settling west of the Appalachians, and this caused some tension between the British and the colonists. But the colonists weren't the only ones who felt a bit uneasy about the future. In the aftermath of the war, the British government decided that it needed to raise revenue to help pay off its massive debt. One way they chose to do this was to impose new taxes on the American colonies. The Sugar Act, for instance, taxed sugar, coffee, cocoa, and put duties on wine and silk. The Stamp Act required the purchase of special stamped paper for every legal document. And the Townshend Acts taxed things like tea and glass and lead and paper. These acts made the colonists very angry. And after years of complaining, the situation came to a head in 1770, when British soldiers fired on a crowd of protesting colonists, killing 5. Tensions continued to rise throughout the 1770s until the infamous Boston Tea Party in 1773. So, overall, the French and Indian War was a pretty significant event for North America. In a way, it helped set the stage for the American Revolution, and that's why it's important to understand the role that geography played in the conflict. The French and Indian War fundamentally reshaped North America. While the vast forests of the Ohio Valley echoed with the sounds of war, entire nations rose and fell. The outcome of the war reverberated across continents, leaving an indelible mark on the world. Now the French language is barely spoken in North America, their vast empire reduced to scattered pockets of Quebec and Louisiana. Those who fought in this war are long gone, but the impact of their actions continues to shape our world today. After all, imagine for a moment what life would be like if France still held vast territories across North America. Would the United States even exist? Would Canada be a French-speaking nation? Would the United States have more in common with France than it does with Britain? It's impossible to say. All we can do is reflect on the past, learn from it, and appreciate how fortunate we are to live in such a peaceful time. Now, the forests and rivers of North America are silent again, but the echoes of this war still resonate in our world today. The clash of cultures, the dreams of empire, the struggles for freedom, they're all part of the tapestry of our history. And as we reflect on the past, let us remember the courage, the sacrifice, the indomitable spirit of those who fought here so long ago. Their stories deserve to be told, their memories cherished, for they shaped not only the course of nations, but also the destiny of continents. Thanks for watching.